Good evening, everyone, and welcome to New Hampshire Cemeteries and Gravestones, a New Hampshire Humanities sponsored program. My name is Angela, and I am a library assistant at the Merrimack Public Library. This program is being recorded for later viewing. All images are the property of our presenter, Glenn Knoblock, and may not be reproduced without his consent. Please post any questions as they come to you in the chat. They will be answered at the conclusion of this presentation. Glenn Knoblock is an independent scholar and author of 20 books and over 100 articles. He is also the author and historian on projects relating to Northern New England bridges, New Hampshire cemeteries and brewing history, and African American military history. He has a new book about gravestones from the female perspective titled Granite Women, coming out this fall. Welcome, Glenn.
Thank you very much, Angela. And I want to thank everyone for attending tonight. Just a reminder, this program is sponsored by the New Hampshire Humanities, an organization I've been proud to be a part of for nearly the last 2 decades now. And so I'm really happy to be with you guys virtually in Merrimack tonight. Some of you may recall, I don't know, it's been a year, maybe 2 years since I've done my cemetery tour in Merrimack there. So I'm happy to return yet again in a virtual fashion here. So I think we'll have a lot of fun tonight. As Angela mentioned, if you have any questions, throw them in the chat, or you can save them till the end. And since we got a fairly decent sized group here, and we'll go from there. Now, before we get started, I got one piece of business to attend to. Let me get my screen going here. Oh, we're frozen up. I got to talk about my new research assistant here. I got to give him a big thank you. This is my grandson, Gordon Knoblock. And as I say in the screen, he's gained a lot of cemetery experience in the past year. And so one of these days, he's going to write a book with his own grandpa. But I'm assuming that he is watching tonight here before bedtime, and just proof that the young of age are still interested in history and if you lead them to it, so to speak. So, hey, Gordon, I'll see you soon. And thank you for being such a great kid. And for those of you at the Merrimack Public Library, I'm sure you've probably seen Gordon and his mother, Beth. So make sure you give him a hand if he needs any research help. But let's get to our program tonight. We're going to talk about cemeteries, the gravestones within, and kind of what you can find kind of hidden in plain sight in our cemeteries, both locally and scattered throughout the state. There's a lot of interesting things to be seen out there. And I suspect that I'm speaking to the choir, so to speak, on that point. I'll show you, I have a couple on the screen that are really fascinating. Up in Andover, the Potter Place Cemetery. Who knew New Hampshire had a celebrated ventriloquist buried up there who once had an estate and mansion, which is now burned down. A man named Richard Potter, and he was actually an African-American, formerly enslaved, who went on to become a ventriloquist and a famed entertainer up and down the East Coast. So who knew in central New Hampshire? And more to the local side in the Merrimack area down in Nashua, you have the graves down there off Daniel Webster Highway for a group of men that were all slain during an Indian raid early in the New Hampshire's history. So there's a lot of interesting history to be seen, and that's why I like to go to these places, to find these hidden stories. There's really a couple different types of burials that have taken place in New Hampshire throughout the long years of our history. You see Turkey Hill graveyard there. This is a public cemetery located close to where once the meeting house was. And this was the trend early on. But also in New England and New Hampshire, we talk about wide open spaces and long distances. Some towns were 6 or 8 miles in length, or their land ran along a long corridor, so to speak. And so town cemeteries were not always the only burial sites. Here we see a small burial ground up in Alton, a local neighborhood burial site that has been in use since the late 1700s. And thousands of these cemeteries dot our landscapes throughout New Hampshire. So both the public and the private. And here's a couple others. You can see the old parish cemetery in Lee is one of my favorites. It's got some interesting stones in it. And of course, those on the seacoast have been in use again for a long time. And another beautiful site, again, located next to where the meeting house was. Meeting House Hill, of course, is a fairly common designation. So over in Antrim there, the Meeting House Hill Cemetery. What I mean by the fact that these burial grounds were not consecrated or hallowed, we kind of consider them that way today, but back in the day, especially in the Puritan orthodoxy of the day, if you will, burial grounds, often called the yard, as in the burying yard, were places where the dead were disposed of, where they could be buried. They were not considered sacred places. In some of our earliest cemeteries on the seacoast, the landowners who donated their land to become public cemeteries retained the right to graze their cattle amongst the stones. So, for example, Portsmouth's Point of Grave Cemetery, all the stones are tilting in some degree. And that's not only due to age, but also because of the fact that cows wandered among the stones and tipped them over. So things from colonial times down to present have really changed our perspective. Today, we view them as quiet places of solitude, or again, kind of that idea of consecrated ground. But our colonial ancestors did not think that way. They thought on a more practical basis. Now, the earliest gravestones within these cemeteries and within many communities, every community really, were these unmarked or very simply cut field stones, often with a simple initials or very rudimentary inscriptions. Here we see one for Mrs. W. Up in Effingham, dating 1791. Now you think today, who is Mrs. W? Well, we really don't know. It could be Mrs. Wentworth or Mrs. Wedgwood up there, but we really don't know. Back in the day, though, communities were very small, tight-knit, and everyone knew one another. So our ancestors were not thinking about the future or posterity, so to speak. They were thinking of the here and now. So everyone back in the day in Effingham would have known who Mrs. W was. And it's only today we're kind of left, especially if you're a genealogist or a cemetery enthusiast trying to figure out who is that it presents a little bit of a mystery. It's also important to understand that the gravestones within a cemetery are indicative of the development of a town. From the time of a town's founding till roughly 20 years later is often the time where we see either the lack of gravestones, or again, we see the use of these field stones or unmarked stones. And then once a community is settled and becomes more well established, then we start to see the professionally carved gravestones. It's a sign of civilization, if you will. It is also important to understand that, at least in New Hampshire, all professionally carved gravestones were imported. Now, what I mean by that early on, what I mean by that is they weren't produced in the state. The earliest gravestone producing centers were in Massachusetts, surrounding the Boston area, Charlestown, Dorchester, Boston proper. And then you had places in southern New England, like Newport, Rhode Island, and Middletown, Connecticut, which were close to supplies of stone. Now, I know we call New Hampshire the granite state, but we're pretty small in population. And so, our own native stonecutters really didn't come along until the Scotch Irish settled central New Hampshire around the Merrimack and Londonderry, places like that, beginning in the early 1700s. So these stones you see primarily on the seacoast area dating prior to the 1740s come from elsewhere. You can see this tradition even continues in places like Amherst and Merrimack. Many of the gravestones there came from northern Massachusetts. Why is that? because northern Massachusetts, especially in the area of Harvard, Mass, and places like that, had some gigantic slate quarries that are still in operation today. So, for example, the stone for the Mr. Hopkins and his wife there in Amherst, dated 1792, a beautiful carved stone with a lot of interesting details, came from the Park family, and they were Scotch-Irish immigrants who first came to this country in the 1760s. The father came first, later his sons came, and they were quite widely known for their work in southern New Hampshire. They built the stone jail in Amherst, New Hampshire as well. So again, imported gravestones. On the seacoast, that's where you'll find some of the most fantastic early examples of our gravestone art. For example, the one you see here from Elizabeth Pike made its way to Portsmouth's Point of Grave Cemetery, all the way from Dorchester, Massachusetts. And again, the Foster family of gravestone carvers there. Ironically, they are well known for their winged skulls or death's heads that are kind of shaped like a light bulb. And that's how we identify their stones. So that importation, once 1740s hit, New Hampshire had a few stone cutters, but it really wasn't until after 1800 that they would start to proliferate. Anybody that's looked through an old New England cemetery that was established during colonial times and used well into the 1800s, we'll see a variety of motifs. And that's what we look for. That's what's fascinating as we amble through these places, is to study these stones, try to decipher their meaning. And of course, if you're a genealogist, looking at the wording, and what a thrill when you find a relative that you've been searching for. It's great when you do it on paper or online through ancestry.com, but there is nothing better than visiting a local cemetery and viewing these gravestones in person. That's why I kind of refer to them, by the way, as kind of stone leaves in a book, if you will, that help to really tell those family stories. And the three motifs that you're going to find the most really are on the left over there in Nashua. We see the gravestone for Nathaniel Prentice, the son of Reverend Prentice, Nathaniel Prentice in Nashua. And that's what we call the winged skull, or commonly known as the death's head. And it has some of these morbid themes with it. Notice the outline of the old-fashioned coffin below and the hourglass, these emblems of death. These were emblems that were brought over from the old country of England, and they were in use really from the late 1600s and well into the 1700s. Following that, you'll see in the center what we call a soul effigy. So you'll see many images, some male, some female, some with wings, some without. Here we see in both these other examples here, right, come from Turkey Hill and Merrimack. In this case, we have an infant of Captain Henry and Rebecca Fields, dated 1789. And it almost resembles a figure in a niche, or perhaps it's representative of a minister looking out from the pulpit below. Again, these soul effigies, as we call them, are really not angelic in nature necessarily, but kind of are representative of the souls of the deceased. And so there's a lot of interesting variations there. And then, of course, on the right here, we see for the Tarbell family, also in Merrimack, the funerary urn and the willow tree. So these are interesting symbols as well. And they're actually the longest lasting of our gravestone images to be found in New Hampshire and New England at large. So let's talk about the winged skull. It's one of everybody's favorites. I mean, it just, when you think of an old graveyard, if you were going to draw a cartoon of an old graveyard, you're probably going to use something like this, right? A winged skull. And again, they reign supreme from the 1600s early into the 1740s and beyond. And what they do is they kind of symbolic of the Puritan orthodoxy that was in play in New Hampshire. Even though New Hampshire was settled differently than the Massachusetts Bay Colony, the idea of the Puritans, their very stark religious nature, their kind of Calvinistic orthodox that stated that very few upon their decease would gain the rewards of heaven. And not only that, the destination of your soul was preordained. You could live the best life possible, the most moralistic life possible, but you didn't know if you were going to make it to heaven. So these symbols are kind of dual in nature, in that the skull itself represents our coming mortality, right? Death that comes to us all. However, the wings are offer that hope of ascension to the heavens. And then you have all the elements on the side borders, the fantastic fruits and gourds, sometimes floral elements that are indicative of the rewards of heaven, should you be one of the elect few to go there. I really like this stone for John Rogers, again, the son of Ye Reverend Mr. Nathaniel and his wife, Mrs. Sarah Rogers, who was only 5 years old when he died in 1719. Notice at the top of that stone, you'll see this imagery, looks like curtains, right? And again, this has dual symbolism. The curtain represents the drawing down of a life coming to a close. If any of you have ever heard that theatrical term, it's curtains for him. Again, that dates back to Shakespearean times, that phrase. But it's also, again, representative of the close of life. So we think of them in the morbid sense of the word, but Puritans, as they're looking at this symbol, really saw it from several different perspectives. And here's a couple different examples. Now, these winged skulls or death heads come in all varieties. Some of them are quite stylistic, as in Kingston from 1743, who has a, one with some widely upswept wings attached to it. Here we see on the left in Portsmouth, Sally Sherburne, the late consort, that's another old-fashioned term for wife of Captain Benjamin Sherburne, as well as their daughter, Sally Sherburne, who had just been born and died within hours. So there's not much hope in that gravestone. It's all about the more mortal elements and less about the dualism in that case. And again, stones like this, even though they would fall out of favor as religious views changed, they would never go away entirely, until the early 1800s. So it had a long place in our motif history. However, by the 1740s, it was out of step with the times, and for one very good reason. By the 1720s, 20 years earlier, the church attendance in New Hampshire and New England was falling off, right? People, there's only so many times you can be told you're going to hell before you kind of grow weary of that message. And people started falling away from the Puritan orthodoxy, and going to church every Sabbath was certainly part of their routine, but it was just that, routine, okay? But then came the 1740s and the Great Awakening, where these new form of religion comes about, where ministers, what were called New Light ministers, preaching a new way, said that, wait a minute, if you did live a good life, you would get to heaven. And so their messages were joyful and uplifting. And these ministers, these New Light ministers, especially the early evangelical ones like Reverend George Whitefield from England, who traveled all throughout New Hampshire and New England, spreading his message, drew thousands of people back to the faith. And so we needed motifs to really reflect this new joy in religion. However, sometimes extraordinary situations would bring back the death's head, if you will. For on the left, we have one of the most famous gravestones in all of New England, and that's for Lydia Worcester, the wife of Captain Noah Worcester, over in Hollis, in the Hollis churchyard there. This has been, ever since books have been published about New England gravestones, this gravestone has been featured, and it shows a coffin flanked by two skulls. And as the stone says, Lydia was not delivered in childbirth in the 39th year of her age in 1772. Memento mori, that old Latin phrase meaning remember death, okay? So again, a very distraught Captain Worcester, kind of reverting to the old theology, if you will, to find some measure of comfort. And then we have, during the American Revolution, for Jacob Tilton over in Portsmouth, in peace amidst the noise and rage of war. So again, these types of stones were quite common, and again, wouldn't go away really until the early 1800s. However, with the Great Awakening, we start to see these fantastic soul effigies. Now, I know some of you may question, why isn't that an angel on that screen? The orthodoxy remained the same. They were still Puritans, but with a new message, okay? And even though angels appear in the Bible, the Puritans were all about the sparseness of their religion. You might decorate a church's interior with some angelic figures, cherubs, but still in the graveyard, it was really all about these representations of the soul after death. Nicholas Gilman over in Exeter, by the way, who died in 1748, was one of these so-called New Light ministers. And he did something really fascinating. You know, he didn't just preach out of his church pulpit in Exeter there. He preached to his followers in a more intimate fashion. He took them out in the deep, dark woods at night to give his sermons of hope and joy. And because of that, ironically enough, he caught a cold and he eventually died from preaching in this manner. His followers, though, bore him to his grave on their own shoulders and commissioned this fantastic gravestone, which was carved by a member of the Lamson family down in Charlestown, Massachusetts. And it would have been quite expensive for the day, and it's very large. So again, as I say on the screen, scary is out of style, hopeful and serene, and whatever form it may take was kind of in. And again, these soul effigies really represent the wide range of human emotion. That's what I like about them. And they also, who do they represent? Do they represent the deceased? Do they represent the ideals of the family of the deceased? Or do they represent the ideals of the artist who created the stone, the gravestone carver themselves? And that's why we don't really know what the message is. But we see on the right there a very typical male soul effigy for McGaw family of Merrimack, very famous early family in Merrimack. They operated a tavern in Meredith. I'm sorry, in Merrimack. And again, the soul effigy that they chose for Margaret in this case did not match her sex necessarily, but was a very common one carved by the Park family of stone cutters down in Massachusetts. Remember that most of our rural New Englanders were semi-literate. Most of them could not read Latin. So that phrase, memento mori, remember death, is here literally translated at the top of their stone. So we retain the old-fashioned messaging, but with this soul effigy. However, my most favorite soul effigy gravestone, again, is found in the Hollis Churchyard Cemetery. And this is for Ruth Jewett, who died in 1757. And the Jewetts were well known in Merrimack. Ruth was considered a particularly in good standing in her church, and one of the leading lights in her community, if you will. And so when you look at this soul effigy for her, you can see the joy in it, perhaps that she or her family had in her going to meet her maker. Okay. And I like it. The wings are so dynamic. It looks like they're going to flutter right off that stone. It's such a happy imagery that really, again, shows a different side of perhaps our New England persona, if you will. And again, many different forms you can find out there. You've got the very classic angelic figure in the center. Down in Amherst, you have the stone for Rebecca Hardy there on the left, where we literally have the representation of a woman. You can notice her collared dress and her bangs carved on her face there. Again, so a beautiful stone. Sometimes we see the female form. Some of them sometimes are a little ambiguous, as in Elizabeth Penhallow there on the right bottom. We don't quite know what sex is shown there, and it's got kind of an ambiguous look, which I think, even the most religious of our ancestors approaching death might have had some some trepidation. Where is my soul going to go? As they were on their deathbed, perhaps. And then above that, from East Kingston, you see a soul effigy that definitely looks a little bit worried. So again, the wide range of human emotions can be found. I like these stones too, because they, sometimes convey a message. Okay. And once again, Hollis, if you have not been to the Hollis churchyard, I've advertised it quite a bit here. Go there, make a summer trip of it. It is a beautiful place, and you'll find some of the best carvings in all of New England. This is another one of my favorites, though, for these two children of the Webster family, dated 1759. And those beady little set-in eyes that you see there. Notice the trepidation on that face there. But it's got the softening elements above. It's got the heart, the swirling designs, the pinwheel designs on either side. But what is fascinating about those eyes is no matter where you go in the cemetery, if you can spot this stone, those eyes are staring at you. It's sending that subtle message. Again, to think about the destination of your soul, right? So the minister's message, so to speak, the religious messaging of New England society was at work, not just in the pulpit, but also in the cemetery proper. And of course, sometimes this messaging is all too obvious, right? Here we have Captain Jeremiah Post, who was killed during the Battle of Bennington in 1777. He was from Orford, part of the militia gathered by our famed General John Stark of New Hampshire. And so this is carved by a Vermont stonecutter named Gershom Bartlett. We call him the hook and eye man because of the way he shaped his eyes and eyebrows, and his nose on his figures looks like two fish hooks come together. But again, we can see that worried or unhappy expression of Captain Post losing his life in combat there. Now we talk about ever changing. So if anybody thinks a New England graveyard is static, once you look at the progression of the motifs that you find there, you'll see that as things change over the years. And once again, we have by the 1760s, yet another motif appears. Now it's important to understand that all these motifs can be carved simultaneously. You can have a new stone erected with a death's head in the 1760s or with a soul effigy. It was really up to the family, right? Whatever contractor, whatever stonecutter they contracted with, that's what they chose. But some were on the cutting edge and wanted the leading fashion. So graveyards, believe it or not, are fashionable places. They indicate what was in fashion at the time. A little bit slower moving than perhaps fashion in what clothes folks wore, but nonetheless fashionable. And it's all about the neoclassical elements from the 1760s onwards. And this is the first non-American influence, if you will, Greek and Roman influences based on the discoveries that were being made, or I should say rediscoveries that were being made, Greek and Roman classical architecture, as well as Egyptian influences. So there's where we see the floral elements. The willow tree, it's important to remember, is not native to America. And it has a long history. It's even mentioned in the Bible. It used to, if I'm not mistaken, the willow tree guarded the entrance to Hades in some mythology. So, it has a European influence. The funerary urns, a lot of people point to cremation. Cremation really didn't start to become popular until the late 19th century in New England. The funerary urn, again, is all about that neoclassical imagery, and also the Egyptians who used funerary urns during their embalming process. So we see a wide variety of elements. On the far left, of course, you've got the Farley family there, dating 1799. It's a beautiful example, a very stylistic example of that willow tree with each branch curving over the funerary urns representative of their loved ones. This is also an interesting stone because notice that their son died stillborn in 1799. And then they had a daughter who drowned sadly at the age of 4 in 1809. So, again, 10 years later, did the young stillborn infant have a gravestone prior to this? Likely not. Again, our New England ancestors were often pretty frugal. And also the, the norms of the day did not require that you erect a cemetery marker. So that's interesting. And then over in Hillsborough there, you see from the 1830s, a beautiful example. And many of these are revival inspired. There were waves of revivals in New Hampshire churches, many of them Free Will Baptist churches. So these types of stones that you see for Hillsborough with the palm fronds and the stars and the clouds above, along with that stylized urn in the center, are really indicative sometimes of some of the revivals that were taking place. Now, what's cool about New Hampshire cemeteries and New England cemeteries in general is that you can find really fantastic artworks that are outside the norm in all time periods. For example, on the right, Samuel Gibson, again in Turkey Hill there, has this fantastic, the largest example of an eternal flame that I've ever seen. So Samuel Gibson's family, whether it was his wife or sons or daughters, really did a good job there picking out an unusual example there that is not a common one found. And then Asa Burnap up in the North Country of Lancaster, you've got the standard funerary urn, but it's surrounded by these elements that perhaps any of you are familiar with the Masonic order. You've got the set, square, and compass. You've got the trowel and spade and pick, not of the gravedigger, but of the mason. And then, of course, you've got the symbols of death on the left there, the hourglass, symbolic of that all of our time is running out. And of course, the outline of the coffin, but with the floral growth on the outline, on the growing out of the coffin. So some fantastic designs. And that's the really cool thing about going cemetery rambling or, finding an old cemetery. Unless you've been there before, you never know what you're going to find. And so there's often some rewarding things to be found. I should mention by us looking at these that the standard gravestone material was slate, again, carved in northern was quarried from northern Massachusetts, and also the Boston Harbor Islands. In the beginning, historians thought that this slate was imported from England. That was discovered by a woman researcher in this area named Harriet Merrifield Forbes in the 1920s, that this was not the case, that really all this slate came locally. Now, other cemeteries, you'll find sandstone or brownstone type stuff, or some unusual rock that is quarried locally. After 1800, we start to see more examples of marble that is locally quarried or comes from Vermont carvers, or limestone, which is can be produced in any community, very easily produced, and those are white, gleaming white color. So a wide variety of materials, but slate had the longest use, and really, even today, professional gravestone carvers. I have a good friend named Allison Blake Steele, who is a gravestone carver in the old style, and she does beautiful work, and they use slate. Slate will last 300, 400, maybe 500 years. We see stones that we're looking at right here on this page that have been around for a long time, and if they're taken care of, will continue to be around. You also see some actual portraits. So we talked about our soul effigies, but there were examples. They're fairly rare. There's less than 10 examples in New Hampshire, and you see a little bit more in Massachusetts of actually portraits of the deceased. One of the earliest one in New Hampshire, and really the most exquisite, is that for Abigail Frost over in Newcastle. She died when she was just a young woman, 22, but she was an accomplished young woman. Her father, the Honorable John Frost, was a wealthy merchant, good government connections, had probably the largest library in Newcastle. And it's said that unlike most women, he allowed her to be educated, encouraged her to read the books in their library. And she actually was a poet of sorts. So, and she was also, like many young women of the day, very religious. It's said that hope was the anchor of her soul. And so on her gravestone there, we see that anchor. We see the eternal flame, the dancing cherubs there holding the olive branch, very beautiful. This is when we look at gravestone, this is not just a gravestone, it's a sculptured work of art. And the cameo there is believed to be an actual image of Abigail herself, because it's not repeated in any other gravestone, graveyard or among carvers that we find anywhere else in New England. And it's very likely many parents would have cameo portraits done of their daughters or their wives. And it's believed that in this particularly commissioned stone, it was a portrait of his daughter in stone. Now, closer to Merrimack, down in Fitzwilliam, you have Jane Felch from the Victorian era. This is one of the, again, a later version, but shows a Victorian era woman surrounded by the floral elements. And again, showing her in profile with her hairstyle of the day. It's an absolutely beautiful stone. So again, we see these mostly from the colonial era, but every once in a while you'll find a more modern example. And then of course you find these unusual stones that you're really trying to figure out. And you're like, what is this? And they're pretty fascinating. If you look on the left there for the ones in Surrey, we say that gravestones are often an indicator of wealth. The largest gravestone or monument in a cemetery is indicative of a family or a person's wealth, no doubt about it. The largest gravestones you're going to see are for founding town fathers or mothers. You're going to see it for the local judge or a probate judge or the militia captain or militia general. In this case, though, for this McCurdy family, we see the literal price of their gravestone carved at top. It's really weird. It's only in Surrey. Don't ask me why. I don't know. Maybe they were trying to send a message. The amounts that they paid for those gravestones, that includes the headstone and the footstone. That's not an exorbitant amount for the day. That would be an average price for the day. But maybe we got dueling family members here. One only paid $6.30. The other one got the more expensive version, the Cadillac version at $8.85. Who knows? At the far left, we've got down in Ringe Meeting House Cemetery, which is another really fine meeting house cemetery to visit. We've got this young man from Massachusetts whose mother was from Ringe. He was killed in the Battle of Fredericksburg in Virginia in December of 1862. The gravestone's date is actually wrong. The Battle of Fredericksburg took place in 1862. Now, if you were to look at the top, you see that little hole in there, okay? And it says above it, this is the dart that passed through his heart. And originally in that indent was the musket ball that killed Edwin Platts. Now, I don't know how that gives the family any comfort, but again, it's indicative of the Victorian era, where Victorians really loved to keep kind of morbid elements of their relatives' deaths. For example, fathers and mothers would often be, who had deceased infants, would have still photographs taken with them as a memento to be kept in the family. Sounds kind of gruesome to us, but the Victorians did some pretty interesting things. So that Civil War gravestone is one of the most unusual of the Civil War type that you'll find. And then in the center here, we've got Elder Ira Bowles up in Whitefield. Now, the hand pointing skyward is a very common motif. And again, it's a very simple one to understand. You know, rest in heaven or heading to heaven, something like that. But here we've got a guy pointing down. Now, there's a lot of this stone and a few others up in Whitefield in the North Country have been featured in New England, kind of weird New England type books. And it's always stated that really this carver of this stone was saying this is the destination of this individual's soul. They're going to hell, in other words. Yes, that's a fun thing to think about, but it's not true, actually. And the truth is actually stranger than fiction. Elder Ira Bowles, as his name suggests, was an official, religious official. He was an elder in the Adventist church. Now, the Adventists believe that your soul, upon decease, rests on the earth. It stays in the earth until the coming of the resurrection. And then, and only then, do you go to heaven. So again, if you see this type of stone, maybe for a relative somewhere, don't worry. They didn't think they were going to hell. They weren't up to no good. It just meant they were a Seventh-day Adventists who had a different religious belief than what the common, congregational or Puritan orthodoxy of the day in New England. And of course, you can't help but look at the stones. We're all curious in nature, right? Even me, I've been doing this for well over 30 years now, but I'll admit when I look at these stones, I get feelings of awe, wonder, sadness at how some of these deaths occurred. And we often wonder, why are these methods of death really shown on the gravestone? And some of it has to do with the time. Our colonial ancestors were pretty blunt about death. Death was a part of life back then, and that many people did die young. And then, of course, you have the Victorian era, where, again, Victorians were very, very dramatic, I guess is one way to put it. So in the center for Jonathan and Willie Watson down in Gilmanton, one drowned and one was accidentally shot. That wouldn't give us much comfort in today's world, but somehow that was important to their family members. How people were carried out of this world is also important, especially in late colonial and even early American times. Again, for the young man in Merrimack's Turkey Hill on the right there, who was struck by lightning. Now, anybody that dies struck by lightning today, we can reason with that. But back in the old days, to be struck by lightning and called out of the world in that way was probably, viewed by most as a symbol of God. They weren't looking at it as just a freak weather occurrence. So this was a stunning death to experience, and also one that was filled with messaging. And so, of course, they're going to put that on the gravestone. On the far left for Amherst burial ground, we have to kind of look at some of the hidden history in town. But here we have a stone that's erected in memory of the 3 children of Moses Tennant and his wife. And these are the ones where we have to look a little bit and say, why did these 3 children die in such close proximity? It was actually due to an outbreak of spotted fever that took place throughout New Hampshire between 1812 and 1815. And so Amherst was one of those towns that experienced some successions of deaths in a row. And again, the message there is much more muted. And then in the center, we've got the sculptured hunting dog there. I gave away the story a little bit down in Mount Vernon Cemetery. This tells the story of a hunter and his beloved hound who went off to hunt one day in Mount Vernon. And as the gentleman was getting out of his buckboard wagon, he accidentally discharged his weapon and shot himself. And as he lay bleeding heavily, his dog began to bay, and soon enough, help came. The dog's owner lay on his deathbed for a day or two until he finally passed away. But when he did pass away, his wife decided that what better to stand sentinel over his grave than the hunting dog that he so dearly loved. So William Bruce is his name, by the way. So it's yet another untold story out there. You can find the story on the internet, but one of those hidden parts of our personal stories that are out there in the cemetery. Now, we've talked a lot about the early cemeteries. The New England cemeteries were pretty sparse, pretty plain. Our New England ancestors early on did not believe in decorating the graves of the dead or flowers. The idea of putting flowers on gravestones really came about, after the 1830s with the advent of the rural cemetery movement. And this is also a time, too, when many of our cemeteries, our newly formed cemeteries, are being placed outside out on the outer edges of the town limit. Again, both for practical purposes, the land out there was less valuable, but also for sanitary concerns that they had. But this is also the time when we start to delineate family plots, as you can see here in East Leominster and Derry. And you can see this fantastic wrought iron gates and stuff that really set off the family monuments. And also it begins a trend away from individual monuments to the family monument. So that's quite a fascinating development. The first rural cemeteries were at Mount Auburn in Cambridge, Mass, but also in Philadelphia. And the idea that cemeteries could be places of peace, tranquility, beauty, enhanced beauty by plantings of shrubs, and later on pathways, benches, all those types of things. And of course, the wrought iron fencing. These elements find many beautiful ones, survivors. We also find many that have decayed over the years, and that really leads to difficulties in cemetery repair and upkeep because these wrought iron fences are really expensive to replace. But even in their decay, as you see in East Leominster, they still present a beautiful sight. And of course, many towns are working to get these fixed up. And it's also, by the 1820s and 1830s, we see a shift in the motifs themselves, ones that we're more familiar with and can better relate to in the modern world. These are ones that are more comforting, ones that are more sentimental. Who doesn't like the dove, the symbol of peace, and that dove soaring skyward, taking the soul of the deceased child to heaven. It's when we also start to see these sentimental images, the lamb, the innocence of the child. So this is when we see lambs, sometimes in dual form for two children that have died, perhaps. And we start to see little statues that accompany these gravestones to say our beloved daughter, our darling son, or what have you. So these phrases of sentimentality that really highlight the Victorian era. And remember, all these gravestones were once a beautiful white color. So absolutely beautiful in the cemetery. Even today, even in their muted fashion, they still tell a really sometimes sad story, but also just a very touching story. And probably nothing more touching if you go to Peterborough, their village cemetery. Here we see the children of Charles and Mary Scott. And the youngest child to die was Ella, who was only 3 months, and her brother, who had died 3 years earlier at the age of 7 months. And we see these children lying together, comforting each other. What's fascinating about this image is even though Ella is the younger, she is playing that traditional female role of cradling her brother and comforting him. So it's an interesting, and again, we can see the peace and how this type of imagery might bring some comfort to the grieving parents. However, we see some other interesting things, even in Merrimack, a broken stone, which has a nice floral image. Again, very comforting, very pleasant to look at. In Exeter and Derry in the center there, we see some holdbacks of the earlier days, but we also, by this time, see the appearance of real angels, winged angels in form on our gravestones. Notice the one at the bottom is cutting this rose, right? It's cutting the bud. And this is a symbol of a young life, in this case, Joanna Janvrin, who died at the age of 19, a young life being cut short. So that blooming rose cut down in the prime of life. And that angel who is going to be doing the cutting and will bear it to heaven. And then we have the above element gravestone in Derry, which is really a very nice piece of work. It combines the floral imagery, but you also got the funerary urn with the floral elements spilling out of it. You've got the grapes on the lower left there, kind of the indicative of the religious elements there. And then, of course, the center angel itself. That's the angel Gabriel holding the Bible, calling the deceased to meet their maker. And again, over in Manchester, we've got a beautiful stone erected by a wife for her husband, Thomas Eastman. And again, you've got that star element with the female hand with the heart in the hand there. And again, notice the epitaph at the bottom, the light of home, just shows how much this this man was beloved by his wife. And of course, I have to feature some of the military gravestones. You know, the Civil War really impacted our country everywhere. We read about the Civil War in the history books. There's many thousands of books written about the Civil War. We can read about the Battle of Antietam, or we can read about the horrors of Andersonville prison if you're a Civil War buff. But we don't really understand the impact of that war until you realize that stones like the ones you see here are found in every period cemetery in every town in New Hampshire. These are actually going to be subject of another forthcoming book I have, Civil War era gravestones. So Joppa Hill, Bedford, we have Griggs Holbrook, who died in Andersonville prison, a local boy who served in a New York regiment after moving to that state. In Portsmouth, in the center, we have one, again, erected by the wife of William Maxwell for her husband, who was killed while on skirmish at Sailor's Creek 3 days before the Civil War ended. By the time she got notice of her husband's death, the Civil War had come to an end and Robert E. Lee surrendered. And then the very interesting wording for Robert Twombly in Tamworth, who was killed while tearing down the rebel flag at the Battle of Antietam. So again, that patriotic symbolism or phrasing there, if you will. So other elements to look for in the cemetery. And then, of course, I say, in rare instances, we'll see our animal friends also in our human cemeteries. Now, they are fairly rare, but every once in a while you stumble across one. Fido Maloon over in Meredith Neck is in the Meredith Neck Cemetery there. His master, David Maloon, died, and his dog pined so heavily after the death of his master that Fido died. Now, we can see that Fido was an aged dog, but it was truly believed back in the day that he missed his master so much that he died because of it. The family sought permission from the minister to have their dog buried next to his master, and that's what they did. So Fido, which refers to fidelity, probably can't be illustrated to any higher degree than it was in that family. And then if you care to take a look in the Alton's Riverview Cemetery, it's another favorite place of mine. Not far, you know, a big monument you'll see in there is for Major George Savage, who fought during the war for this Lakes Region town, was wounded in action, came back home, operated a fancy hotel. But the horse that he rode all throughout battle during the war was called Tom, or later Old Tom. And he brought Old Tom home with him after the war. And Old Tom outlived the Major. And so after Savage died, his horse remained with his family. And when Old Tom died, the family wanted to bury him in the cemetery. And the sexton said, no, we're not going to allow a horse to be buried there. So they buried him just outside what were then the current confines of the cemetery. However, that cemetery has expanded and is now encompassed Old Tom there. The Historical Society has done a great job. They've got a picture of Major Savage and Old Tom himself, but that's the largest burial plot, obviously, in the whole cemetery. So again, our love of pets today, again, almost transcends time. So, and with that, you know, we've come to the end. We'll take a look in chat. We'll see what we have in there, what questions you have, but I encourage you, whether it's late summer, fall, to get out there and check out your local cemeteries, or even do a little expedition beyond over to the seacoast, places like Portsmouth. There's a lot of interesting history, a lot of interesting artwork to be seen there. And who knows, maybe me and Gordon will run into you somewhere. You never know. And I will stop my share. We'll go into the chat. Looks like we got a few questions in there. Okay. So the question from Brittany is, why do cemeteries have fences? And that is one reason. And it's also just our early ancestors were ones that really like to delineate the lines. Not only just to keep the boundaries of the cemetery in place, our ancestors in colonial New England and New Hampshire included, you know, oftentimes this was donated land. So boundaries had to be really established, but also, again, to set off that place as a as a place for burials. And I'm sure also, if possible, to keep animals out. It's a little known fact that almost every early New England cemetery, probably in Merrimack too, the first burials probably were marked with a big boulder or rock. We call those wolf stones for the kind of the gruesome reason that the earliest burials, people were worried that wild animals might desecrate these places. So to put a boulder that could be moved from one place to another would really help with that. And then once the town became less wild, grown up a little bit and built up over time, these wild animals aren't so prevalent. The rock is often moved to the back of the cemetery or becomes part of the stone wall itself. I see Richard Balloon has a comment, and yes, Merrimack Historical Society, I'll agree, has done a fantastic job keeping Turkey Hill looking great and stuff like that. So I appreciate these towns. Richard can probably speak to the fact that it is not cheap. It's expensive to do this type of upkeep. And there's a lot of intricate processes involved. I've done some cemetery work in the past. I no longer do that. I've retired from that aspect of it, but it's painstaking work. So thank you for pointing that out, Richard. And Richard's asking about the 4 Worcester occupants at Thornton Graveyard, whether they're related to the famous Worcesters. I couldn't tell you. The Worcester clan, whether it's in Hollis or Merrimack, there's many, many, many Worcesters. So that's not a question I can answer for you. Jennifer has if gravestone rubbings are still permitted. So that's a very thorny question. And here's what I've said for that. There is a New Hampshire state statute. It's been on the books for years, and that statute says gravestone rubbings are forbidden. However, the state does not enforce that. You're not going to have a state trooper pull you over for rubbing a gravestone. And it's really up to the town to decide that. I was on the Cemetery Commission for Portsmouth, which has some of the oldest cemeteries in New Hampshire. We decided not to prohibit gravestone rubbing because we said the benefits of people who want to come to the cemetery and do that outweighed the harmful effects of that. There are towns like Marlow that have signs stating no cemetery rubbings. So it's up to each town. What I advise people who are interested in that art, and it's a really interesting art, I advise them to go get in contact with the cemetery commission, and before a visit, if you're making, especially if you're making a targeted visit and want to rub one particular stone, just ask the question, and chances are you'll get either a hard no, we don't allow it, or yeah, I guess that's okay. So it's a nuanced answer, I know. What I will say to people that do this art or are contemplating doing it is you have to do it right. You can't leave marks on the gravestones. And I know that's obvious, but there are people who abuse it. And it's also important to pick a stone that is not tilted, that is not cracked or any way damaged, so that, let's just put it this way, you don't want to be the one in the cemetery that causes it to break in half. Oh, good, we got Carolyn Shedd's stone fixed. Thank you, Richard. So they're working on that. So you don't want to be the one while you're doing a gravestone rubbing that it cracks in half and falls to the ground. That's not going to be a good feeling, and you're going to be left wondering, what do I do? So don't get in that position. Do we have any other questions out there? I see we got some other stuff on the screen here. Okay, I'm not seeing, let me see if we got anything else in chat. I think we are all done unless anybody has any final thoughts. I would like to thank once again Angela at the library, Max, and for inviting me on this virtual tour. I'm always happy. Merrimack's a town that's near and dear to me for obvious reasons. But you also got some great history down there. So it's nice to be back. And I would like to thank everyone who attended, who's taken time out of their busy summer evening to hopefully learn some fun stuff and maybe inspire you to some new travelings in the future here.
Absolutely. I
Yeah,
am going to add a link to the chat. It is a feedback form, but I want to thank you very much for the thorough presentation on our local cemeteries, Glenn. This
oh, thank
program
you very
was,
much, Angela.
you're very welcome. The program was recorded and everyone registered will receive a link to the Merrimack Public Library YouTube channel to view at your leisure. I have just placed the link for the feedback about the program in the chat. Please let us know how the program went and if there are any topics you'd like the library to cover. Thank you again, Glenn, and everyone who joined us this evening. I hope that you have a wonderful night.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good evening. Bye-bye.